organized by the Center for International Legal Studies at Jindal Global Law School of OP Jindal Global University. It is our seventh and the final webinar of this series. And we're really excited to have Vikram Raghavan as the key speaker and Saravaran as the discussant for today's talk on Babasaheb, Ambedkar and international law. And I'm Ajita Sharma stepping in as a moderator for this talk. So let me briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. Vikram practices international law and contributes to the blog Law and Other Things. He's the author of much consulted treatise, Communications Law in India. He has also co-edited a volume of essays in comparative constitutionalism in South Asia, published by Oxford University Press. And he has edited and introduced George Gadbois's long-lost classic, Supreme Court of India, The Beginnings, published by Oxford, 2017. And Vikram maintains an active private interest in Indian history and constitutional law. He's working on a book about how India became a republic in 1950. And in this seminar, he will be speaking in his personal capacity. And Puko belongs to the 2016 batch of the Indian Revenue Service, Customs and Central Excise. He's an author of 2 books published by Vikatan, a leading publishing house in Tamil, and has completed his undergraduate education in agricultural and irrigation engineering from the College of Engineering, Guindy in Chennai. Thank you, Vikram and Puko. We're really pleased to have you for this webinar. So Vikram, you can start with your presentation now, and you can speak for roughly 40 to 45 minutes, and then Puko can give his comments on the presentation.
Okay, great. Can you hear me, Ajita?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Because if there's any bandwidth problem, let me know. And I just want to confirm everyone can see the screen, the presentation screen. Okay, good. Well, good evening, Jai Bhim. I'm very grateful to both Prabhakar and to Ajita for inviting me to speak in their truly amazing series on the history of international law. As an international lawyer and as a student of international law, rather, I think it's quite exciting and thrilling that you have this series. We didn't have it when I studied international law, and I certainly think that international law as practiced in the West is often overlooks things, important developments and nuances that you have picked up already in the 6 events you've had, including the one you had just recently, which I participated in on the Madras School of International Law. So again, I want to commend both of you for organizing these series, and I think you're doing something truly historic to the field of international law, but also in terms of widening its appeal to a broader cross-section of persons. I'm also grateful that I have here with me my dear friend, Puko Saravaran, who I have learned a lot from. It's one of the highlights of my visits to India to meet him, because I always learn so much from him. He's truly a human force of nature that I cannot describe in words. Those of you who know him or follow him on Twitter know how multifaceted he is and what a great yet humble intellectual he is. So I'm happy to join this panel with him. I'm also grateful. I see lots of friends who have joined and are joining. I see Professor Chimney, the great scholar of the Twail and who has inspired many of us. I see Professor Dr. Gandhi, principal of the Fellow Law College, who was the former legal advisor to the External Affairs Ministry. I see my friend Anurag Bhaskar, who's also just joined. So, and I think others will also join. I see Sudarshan. Anyway, so I thought I would just explain briefly the background to this presentation. I first began, you're going to let people in, right, Ajita? Because I keep getting notifications. Okay. This presentation is really a reflection of research I did a few years ago, but I've tried to update it, of course, in the context of the International Ambedkar Conference that took place in Bangalore about 3 years ago. And I felt it's an issue that we know a lot about Babasaheb's life as a social justice reformer, as the maker of the Constitution, as a polemicist, critique of caste, and a radical historian, as a social justice champion, as a sociologist, and as a constitutional lawyer. In fact, Rohit Day has written an excellent piece that I was just reading again on his overlooked role as a lawyer, right? The cases he argued, and also his contributions to legal scholarship, which itself has been overlooked. But his understanding and appreciation of the grammar of international law, I think, has been even more obscure, partly because this is such a sprawling life that generated so much scholarship, whose archival works are still coming out. The National Archives only now digitized and made publicly available his papers. Many of his papers are still in Marathi, from what I understand, and not been translated. So this is a genre that is still evolving. But what I'm always amazed as a student of international law is the sheer sophistication that Babasaheb sort of employed to basically mastering international law, which itself was a very, if I may say, primitive field at the time he encountered it, because it was still evolving. It was very, very colonial. It had all the problems that people in your series have discussed before. And yet he was able to master the grammar of international law, which as existed in his time, and then marshal it to make his arguments, which I think, again, have been overlooked in terms of the sophistication and the thickness of these arguments, because, of course, they are so multifaceted. They have, strong in sociology and in political theory, in activism, and also in black letter law. So I thought we would sort of basically reflect on Ambedkar and international law. It would be hard to call him an international lawyer, because I don't think there were many international lawyers at that time. But among the leaders of the nationalist movement, or the makers of modern India, there are few who actually equal his knowledge as well as his deployment of international law, which I think we need to recognize. So I want to begin with this scene, which took place 100 years ago on a glorious summer day in June 1919, when many people, you could see, are standing on top of each other, almost jostling for pace, to look into what's called the Packed Hall of Mirrors, which is the French Foreign Ministry, at which where the Treaty of Versailles was signed. This, of course, was the treaty that marked the end of the First World War. It was the war, the treaty that would end the war that began to end all wars, even though, of course, it led to another even bigger war. But among the people who were standing and sort of trying to get a peek into the room was this man, James Shotwell. He was a small, dapper, mustachioed man who was the American delegation's historian to the Paris peace talks. And he had been intimately involved in the treaty negotiations, which led to the founding of the League of Nations. The League of Nations, as we know, was a byproduct of the Treaty of Versailles and the end of the First World War. He was described by the New York Times as one of the most respected and dedicated protagonists of internationalism in the United States. And he was a person who saw the world as a whole and was involved, as we will see, not just in the founding of the League of Nations, but also the United Nations that followed it. Now, 5 years before Versailles took place, a young Indian student heard Shotwell lecture at Columbia University. B.R. Ambedkar was a student there. He had obtained his undergraduate degree from Bombay's Elphinstone College and had come to Columbia on a scholarship to do his master's in 1913. So here, if you find the actual catalog, which Columbia has now digitized, you can see Babasaheb's name showing up as a master's student. Now, it's very interesting. I think there have been lots of recent work on Ambedkar's Columbia years. And I think that what is interesting is he enrolled or audited at least 4 of the courses that Shotwell offered on European history. Now, you can't actually enroll in unlimited number of courses, but you can just show up and listen if the time works, right? And so that's what he did. But it's unclear to what extent when Ambedkar was at Columbia, how much he interacted with Shortwell, because there is no archival evidence that the two of them stayed in touch with each other or corresponded significantly. Even so, my suggestion is that the professor's international cosmopolitanism may have subtly, if not surely, influenced his young student, because this it inspired him this inclination to overlook national jurisdictional boundaries, or for solutions that reach into international law, which I said itself was a subject in the making, and that was largely something which perhaps Ambedkar obtained from his exposure to professors like Shortwell at Columbia, because certainly nobody in India at that time was thinking in this manner. And of course, we have to also acknowledge the other intellectual influences on Babasaheb, Edwin Seligman, and then, of course, more importantly, John Dewey. And there have been lots of recent work on Dewey's impact on Ambedkar and Ambedkar's advocacy of Dewey's theories of democracy and education. Madhav Khosla has written, I think Stroud has written a very good article we were discussing with Pukor the other day. But so these were multifaceted influences, but this influence of international argument, which itself was evolving, is one that's been overlooked. Now, after Columbia, Babasaheb attended the London School of Economics. In fact, both institutions awarded him a doctorate. If I stand to be corrected, he got a PhD from two institutions, right? And which itself, I think, is often forgotten. But he also qualifies then separately to become a barrister. And these additional studies, especially Journey to London, probably also exposed him to international law and international arguments, because Ambedkar arrives in London to complete his graduate work and qualify for the bar just as the League of Nations opens for business in Geneva. And so probably it's in London where he first comes to learn about the League's fledgling institutions, because there was a lot of idealism at that time, somewhat Wilsonian in a way, but in Europe too, there was this idea that the League would be the institution of peace for all time. But it would have certainly exposed Babasaheb to the League's fledgling institutions and how they were reshaping traditional notions of international law, because the League was quite a revolutionary concept at the time it was created. Professor Chimney is here, so he can correct me, because obviously he's the greatest scholar in the field, so I don't want to speak out of turn. But after Babasaheb returns to India, his interest in the subject was probably sustained, because we have recent evidence of the reading his massive library. And so he probably stayed abreast of the latest developments because he was just intellectually curious. But he was also a teacher at Bombay University's, at Bombay's Government Law College. And as we know, his law lectures were prepared and received with great care. And his lecture notes show several pages on international law and practice, which is why I think it's not just a fleeting flirtation with international law. If you're a law teacher, I think that you have to keep up, and this is a field that's changing as you see it. And so obviously this is quite interesting, because you find these notes where Ambedkar basically explains to his students why the Irish Free State fails to register a treaty with the League. This is a new concept of registration of treaties. We now have it in the Charter in 102, 104, where countries can register treaties with the Secretary General of the United Nations. And so this is in the 1930s. He's already explaining these concepts, which were very new at that time, and explains why Britain vigorously opposed the filing, because on the ground that did not apply to entities within the Commonwealth, right? So this is a sophistication of arguments that are sort of very interesting for its time. Now, of course, we have to move on, because we can't fully appraise Babasaheb's life and as an activist and lawyer in this short time. But I think one thing stands out among the many struggles and that he was involved with his as he gained stature as the leader of the so-called depressed classes, because he draws national attention by organizing Dalits to demand equal access to a water tank that had been used by upper castes in Mahad. And in the Mahad speeches, is for the first time, at least that I have noticed, that he warns his opponents that he would complain to the League. Now, this itself is quite dramatic because, the idea, the other leaders of the nationalist movement were basically looking to British institutions. And here he argues for the first time, we would complain to the League if Dalits are prevented from exercising their legitimate rights. And he accuses caste Hindus of hypocrisy for protesting anti-Indian policies in South Africa and Britain while turning a blind eye to anti-Dalit discrimination in their own country. Now, again, there is a conference that Babasaheb attends in August 1930, where he brings up the League again and argues that a right to appeal to the League would be a very desirable addition to the armory for Indian Dalits. Now, this is again, an interesting concept because the League of Nations, again, was dealing with a very primitive form of international human rights. It did not have the present system of international human rights with all the covenants and the oversight bodies that we have today. But many European minorities had been given, partly because of all the complications of geography and history at the time of the Versailles Conference, a right to appeal to the League, right? And what it appealed to, there is lots of new PhD thesis on this whole idea of right to appeal. It's actually quite an interestingly studied issue these days. But it was very much a right enjoyed by European minorities. But I think it took Babasaheb's creativity to apply it or to seek to apply it to Indian Dalits as well. Now, of course, he acknowledged the problems with making this argument. So he was not trying to make a rhetorical point. He knew the nuance that was needed, that was required to approach this sort of claim. But yet it's interesting, as he sails, just before he sails to London to participate, as you know, he participated in the first roundtable conference. He promises his supporters that he would brief world leaders about their oppression by caste Hindus and approach the League if necessary about this matter. Now, it is unclear whether the League would have entertained a petition from appeal if one was filed. Here it did, as I said, have specific arrangements for handling appeals or petitions from Central and Eastern European minorities. Here's a copy of one it received from Hungarian workers. It also got interesting appeals from all kinds of minority groups around the world. But its jurisdiction to entertain them, unrelated to specific minority groups that were contemplated, or the mandate system, which is another subject in international law, was far from clear, right? But it is very interesting that Babasaheb sort of was still quite interested in the idea that, he concedes that the League's appeal mechanism would not be a very effective weapon because it could not be counted, the organization could not be counted upon to come to the aid of minorities around the world. But he continues to throw out the possibility that Dalits could petition the League about their conditions. Now, why did Babasaheb threaten to go to the League? And again, you can offer a lot of speculation from so far away. But perhaps one way he felt would, by internationalizing the situation, he would shame sort of caste Hindus into changing their sort of oppressive behavior. He may also, this is what Eleanor Zilliot says, the great the scholar who studied one of the first scholars of Babasaheb. But there's also evidence that perhaps he had heard that other anti-colonial activists were quietly submitting petitions to the League about abusive conditions in colonies, including African-American lawyers who were doing that, the same about racism in the United States. But it is also possible that Babasaheb may have concluded that Dalits were unlikely to prevail before British Indian courts, right? Because in religious and community matters, judges relied so heavily on scriptural and legal interpretations from caste lawyers and scholars. And in fact, the Mahad agitation had been itself hampered by a court injunction. And so he may have reasoned that colonial courts were simply incapable of impartially adjudicating discrimination-related claims, and Dalits would probably get a better deal or perhaps get more we heard more effectively if they approached an international forum like the League instead of wagering their bets before unsympathetic Indian judges. Now, petitions weren't the only League feature that Babasaheb advocated. He was also influenced by the binding nature of the League's minority regimes. This is, again, a whole different subject, but he argued that entrenched minority safeguards in cultural representation for the depressed classes was something that they were entitled to. So again, it's the idea that he's reaching out to the system to make arguments of emancipation. Now, we have to move on, which is the invasion of Germany into Poland in September 1939, which is when Ambedkar sort of issues his first noteworthy statement about foreign policy. At least he comes out very strongly and condemns the aggression, calls upon Indians to fully support the war effort, and believes that it is a truly golden opportunity for Dalits to gain greater social and professional acceptance. And of course, at this time, he also laments that India lacks an independent voice in foreign policy, war and peace, although it is entitled to a greater stake in future peace terms, right? So it's a very interesting statement that he puts out, which is strategic, future-looking, but also very much anchored in the real politic of the time. Now, of course, during the war years, we know that Babasaheb joins the cabinet of Viceroy Lithgow. Well, he's first appointed to the Defense Advisory. This Defense Advisory Committee. It's created ostensibly to mobilize public participation in the war effort in the face of bitter opposition from the Congress leadership. In the following year, he is appointed to the Viceroy's War Cabinet and given the labor portfolio. I think this is another overlooked part of Babasaheb's career, that he was a member of the cabinet even before. Now, this is where, again, I submit his exposure and interest in international law really comes to the fore and is being neglected. Because as part of his responsibility for dealing with labor issues, he had to have extensive dealings with the International Labour Organization. India was a founding member of this organization. Remember, it's one of the earliest international organizations, quite unique in the way it's organized because it has all these non-governmental elements to it. But it's also founded with the League at the Treaty of Versailles. And ILO's conventions and standards are very much an early influence on Indian law, even before other aspects of international law, because the ILO was busy putting out standards and conventions much before any other international body existed. And Ambedkar enthusiastically supports India's participation in the organization, and through his speeches and statements expresses an intent to implement the country's ILO commitments. This itself is quite amazing, how he's looking to international law now to set a standard for Indian legislation, right? Now, it's a happy coincidence that his mentor or his former professor, James Shotwell, is one of the great ILO proponents. In fact, Shotwell writes 2 important books on the ILO and is a big spokesman because Shotwell feels the ILO can promote social change through international cooperation as an alternative to bloody revolution. And this approach, in a way, aligns perhaps neatly with Babasaheb's own sort of cosmopolitan outlook and belief in international legal cooperation, at least witnessed through what I just explained in terms of his looking to the League for petitions and minority protection to use the international legal cooperation to effect social change. Now, this is a bit of a leap to make, but it's an interesting one because you see here the student and the teacher's lives kind of coming overlapping, even if they didn't personally reconnect. Now, there are lots more details I can provide, but we need to move on because here in 1942, for instance, Ambedkar announced the Angry Advisory Committee on Labor, which he models after the ILO's governing body, which itself is still very unique in international law today because it's not a totally state-dominated entity, right? It has representatives both for it has representatives of governments, but also of trade unions. And he proposed doing the same in India by providing seats for employer-employee representatives on the Standing Advisory Committee on Labor. Now, we have to move on, which is at this time, of course, Babasaheb is a member of the central legislature. Remember, this is the legislature that existed before the parliament. And you see here in the debates, in his interventions, his familiarity with international law really comes to the fore. And so again, many interesting examples. He stands up to defend the removal of wartime restrictions on women workers in coal mines, and argues that this decision is needed because of wartime necessities. And he points out that these restrictions were made, concedes they were made due to an ILO convention that had been in place for 4 years. But he also argues, like a good international lawyer, that these restrictions can be removed consistently with international law, because every country has the right to break an international convention or treaty under certain circumstances, right? So this is much before the Vienna Convention codifies the grounds on which you can basically, reject or repudiate a treaty. Of course, part of it is codifying customary international law, but it's quite interesting to see how effortlessly he makes this argument in the central legislature. Now, again, we don't have time to cover all of it, but if you look at his piloting the factories Second Amendment bill on paid holidays, he introduces the amendment to give effect to an ILO convention on paid holidays. Now, what is interesting is India has not chosen to ratify the convention. But Babasaheb notes that the government has consulted employers and employees about implementing it. And even though India has not ratified it, it gives effect to it in law. And he explains why. He also says India chooses not to ratify this convention because many of these conventions lack flexibility in implementation. So even though they may not be, they are certainly persuasive and in this case, influential in the making of Indian law and policy. Very interesting to see this sort of line of argumentation. Now, of course, we move on to what was happening at the time as the communal situation tensions rise across the country. This demand for Pakistan becomes a drumbeat. And in a way, the most published evaluation of objective evaluation of the Muslim League's demand for Pakistan is by Babasaheb in this famous book, which I still think is the must-read book that is most overlooked, again, because of the vast amount of scholarship that he produced. I think this book, which is actually a very deep and serious book, and probably one of the most penetrating sort of studies on international international politics at the time, behooves a rereading. Because it's besides being a study of the relevant legal and constitutional issues, it also includes an interesting chapter on self-determination, which was very much an emerging concept in international law at that time. And it was very clear that he'd already studied this area, which was very new, right? And then, of course, he makes arguments that negotiations could only negotiations could satisfactorily resolve the problems between India's Muslim and Hindu communities. And he interestingly suggests that the minorities problem be referred to arbitration, to international arbitration with arbitrators outside the British Empire. Fascinating suggestion. I don't know if the strong international arbitration bar that exists today dominates in a way the field of professional international law, is even aware that Babasaheb was a votary for international arbitration, because he felt international arbitration would help address the Congress Party's claims or doubts about British neutrality, right, in arbitrating the claims of minorities. And he argues that this would an arbitration process would ensure minority consent for a future Indian constitution, and the British government would have to undertake to implement the arbitral body's decision, like what we have today, very much in domestic and international arbitration. Now, of course, he then looks at, how the League was approaching using arbitration in Mussolini's disputes with Abyssinia. We know what happened to that, but it's very interesting to see he was very much abreast to, with, again, these modern uses of international law at the time he was, making arguments in India. Now, we have to move on, which is the sort of, again, this communal situation then leading to partition. And as we know, as the chaos of partition unfolds, Travancore and Hyderabad both announced they would revert to full independence after the British left India. Now, Prabhakar has written a very, very good piece on paramountcy and princes, right, Prabhakar? And he's one of, in a way, revived interest in this doctrine, which has long been forgotten because it's not taught in Indian law schools. The doctrine that greatly troubled constitutional lawyers at the time of independence, which is that princely states claimed once the British sort of left India, their the full plenitude of their sovereign powers would return to them because the paramount power ceased to exist. The doctrine of paramountcy, which was first invented by a British lawyer in the 30s, that actually seemed to be the big unknown in the room, because all of these states claimed they would revert to independence. And the two states that made this argument most vividly were Travancore and Hyderabad. Of course, Travancore's Diwan at that time, C.P. Ramaswamy, was the person who basically propounded this to the hilt and made the argument in its full force. And what is forgotten, I think, completely, is it was Ambedkar who stepped forward, not anybody else, to meet this argument legally, this argument of paramountcy. Now, I think Professor B.N. Rao, my friend Arvind Ilangovan, the sort of biographer of Sir B.N. Rao, might be on the call, but and I would be curious to know if B.N. Rao had a view. But the rebuttal to this very dangerous, or at least potent argument of paramountcy, which would have been a severe threat to the integration of the princely states, was by Ambedkar in the most comprehensive, decisive way, because he argues that paramountcy is a crown privilege, and that the dominion of India, which would be a succeeding state in international law, again, look at his reaching for international law, the India as a succeeding state would inherit the privileges of its predecessor state, British India, and that the only way that Travancore and Hyderabad could be freed from paramountcy would be for them to join the Indian Union as constituent units. Now, because, so CP had also warned that his state would seek UN recognition, and Ambedkar tried to call his bluff, and he said, look, the UN will not recognize, the UN would not ignore India's suzerainty over Travancore. It would refuse to protect Travancore unless there was responsible government established within the territory. So again, very interesting sort of argumentation, which has been somewhat forgotten. Now we move on, which is again, while he's here trying to basically make these arguments, but also now gets involved in the Constituent Assembly, which we'll come to in a second. He's also increasingly frustrated by the lack of progress on social justice and discrimination. And so in July 1946, he revives his plans to submit an international petition or a complaint about discrimination in India. And to that end, he writes to the great African-American activist, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was working for the leading civil rights organization at the time, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, as its director for special research. And Ambedkar asked Du Bois whether it is true that the National Negro Congress, another civil rights organization at the time, had just petitioned the United Nations about racism against African Americans. And he tells Du Bois in this letter, I'm sorry, it's not very clear on the screen, but he tells him that the untouchables of India were thinking of following the lead of the National Negro Congress, and he asked Du Bois for a petition, for a copy of this petition. Now, what is very interesting is Du Bois responds to Babasaheb's letter and sends him the National Negro petition, but he realizes that nothing had been done about this petition. So after the letter is Du Bois is reminded, he then sort of urges his colleague now, to finalize the petition. So you could even suggest that Ambedkar unwittingly may have sort of provoked them into action, because they go ahead and then submit this petition to the United Nations, which had now come into being. And so this itself is, I think, this is very interesting. Daniel Immerwahr has written about this. Nico Slate has written about this. Lots of interesting new work on the subject. We move on, which is to the end of the war and the San Francisco Conference, where the United Nations was founded to replace the League of Nations. And guess again who was there? It's Ambedkar's former teacher, Shotwell. In fact, he helped draft many of the Charter's key provisions on economic and social rights. Now, again, it's unclear to me as to whether the two of them were still in touch, but at its first session, the General Assembly votes to censure South Africa for its treatment of Indian residents. Vijayalakshmi Pandit lobbies for this, and encouraged by this development, India's lobbying, the NAACP asked the UN Commission on Human Rights to investigate racial discrimination in the United States. Now, of course, this petition is eventually unsuccessful, but again, it sort of prompts Ambedkar to prepare his own petition to the UN, like he wanted to do, to highlight the scheduled caste suffering on account of social, economic, and political tyranny. Now, it is unclear to me. Well, the All India Scheduled Caste Federation approves the Ambedkar Memorandum in January 1947. But it's not clear to me why it was not subsequently taken up. I suspect it's because Dr. Ambedkar became busy with the Constituent Assembly and his involvement in the cabinet. It would have been perhaps awkward for him to send this memorandum while being a serving member of the cabinet. I don't know. I think this is where I would like to be enlightened by others. But we have to move on, which is to his service, of course, in the cabinet, but also in the drafting committee. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because this is something which, of course, many people are better qualified than me to even discuss. But I think among many of Babasaheb's contributions to the making of the Constitution, I think one interesting thing that people forget, besides the draft Constitution, was how he sat sort of, almost consistently, consistent presence on the Treasury benches or, among the people piloting the various amendments and moving drafts, and was asked to intervene in the Assembly's debate. I think one thing people forget, because so much attention is focused on the speeches that he makes, are his interventions and amendments. We know thousands of amendments were mooted. But these amendments largely lived or died based on what Rajendra Prasad thought was Ambedkar's body language at the time. Yes, Dr. Ambedkar, do you agree? If he agreed, the amendment typically survived. If it didn't, it died there. And I think that is quite amazing. He was this gatekeeper for all these amendments, right? So I think that's often forgotten. And many of these amendments raised questions of international law and foreign relations, and he tackles them with great ease, right? So during the debate on citizenship, he explains cogently why the draft Constitution, I think Article 6 or 7, bars persons who left for Pakistan from subsequently claiming Indian citizenship. There is a constitutional bar on that in our Constitution. And he argues, as a universal proposition of international law, every person who is conferred with domicile by birth, and in the absence of a textual bar, those who left for Pakistan after partition was announced could invoke their birth domicile to remain Indian citizens. And it was an express constitutional provision that was necessary to render such claims inadmissible. Now, as many of us know, Babasaheb was also responsible for piloting Article 51, which is the provision in our Constitution on international law. It exhorts the Indian state to promote international peace and security, maintain just and honorable relations between nations, foster respect for international law and treaty obligations, and encourage the settlement of international disputes by arbitration. Yes, you can see here the Ambedkarite vision, right? Look at that focus on arbitration. Look at the idea of, basically fostering respect for international law and treaty obligations. You could argue, what is the meaning of organized people? But this introducing the final provisions of final wording of this article. He says they are almost self-evident, and it would be arrogant for him to make a lengthy speech. I'm quoting from him. And he seemed very sort of satisfied that the Indian Constitution was among the first in the world to clearly express the idea that India's foreign policy must be bounded on constitutional principles, right, and respect for international law. In fact, you can argue this is an early articulation of the idea of constitutional morality in foreign policy. Our foreign policy, now I don't want to get into the subject, but has always thought of such a realist thing, right? There's no constitution doesn't follow the flag, right? But if you read Ambedkar's Article 51 intervention, you may get a different view. Article 253, of course, is the other provision in our constitution on international law. It's the provision that allows for Parliament to override the list system in the 7th schedule to give effect to international treaties. And again, he is the lead batsman for this provision, and he defends this provision against claims that it undermines the rights of states by arguing that Parliament, under the Indian Union's basic design, enjoys exclusive competence for overall international affairs, including the making of treaties, right? And he also discusses at that time India's membership in international organizations, what was required. He actually gives an opinion to the assembly saying that no express constitutional provision is needed. There's a question, I think there's an entry in one of the union lists on a membership of the UNO, but he suggests that we don't need to actually have an enabling provision in the constitution for India's membership in the UN. On another occasion, the House listens again with rapt attention, as Ambedkar explains, the extraterritorial reach of Indian criminal law. Very interesting. And he assures members that the union's control over minerals and other things of value, again under the union list, would lie within India's territorial waters is perfectly consistent with international law at that time. So you could not make these arguments if you did not know international law, right? It was not something that you could just stand up and make these claims. And it was clear from, if you read his speeches, he would read the authorities on the subject. Now, just to sort of, coming towards the end, of course, at independence, sort of Babasaheb is, joined the cabinet. Now, of course, again, this is controversial in terms of, whether they tried to basically put him to one side, gave him the law portfolio. But again, you can see, again, this interest in international law comes when he moves a bill as a law minister. The CPC amendment, the amendment itself is quite innocuous. It's about whether diplomatic immunity should be extended to diplomats other than ambassadors. So it's the CPC amendment proposed in 1951 to the Provisional Parliament. And during the debate, a member challenges Ambedkar's point that there is no unanimity in international law on the subject. He argues, saying that the authorities are mixed. He quotes different scholars, and Ambedkar tells the member very politely but tellingly, "I have before me several extracts from treaties from dealing with international law, and I do not wish to weary the House by reading them. I can assure the House that I do not find any such unanimity from the extracts before me." So he clearly is, obviously quite confident enough to pilot this and then, sort of obviously defend its theoretical basis in international law. Now, also during this time, of course, Babasaheb is sort of gradually alienated. He feels
I think we
yeah,
Vikram
okay,
seems to...
you got me back. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
back.
we can hear you now.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. So I guess I was at the cabinet. You heard me until the controversial Hindu court bill. Was that the last point? What point did you lose me at? Hello?
Vikram, you were speaking about how he felt alienated towards the
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So actually that's where actually I had stopped. So he felt alienated towards that he was not being given his dual role. And he basically resigns from the cabinet. But if you read the resignation letter, he lists foreign policy as one of the top reasons for leaving, arguing he was excluded from the cabinet committee on foreign affairs and defense committees, and argues that India was plowing a lonely furrow at the UN, and makes a lot of other claims on foreign policy. Now, finally, in the first general election, Babasaheb's party, the All India Scheduled Caste Federation, contests the first general elections. What is interesting is that the manifesto, the party's manifesto, contains an extensive discussion on on foreign policy, which itself is very interesting, right? And you could argue also influenced by his interest in international law and relations. Of course, he loses this election in 1952. And then is elected to the Rajya Sabha, and I'm sort of fast forwarding the next month. And what is interesting is here he makes very interesting speeches, including this most important speech he makes in 1954 on foreign policy, where he recalls, among other things, how badly drafted the international boundaries are in the Treaty of Versailles. Right? I mean, coming back a full circle to where we began, and he argues that India was sort of, going down the similar lines. It's a very interesting speech to look at. Now, I just wanted to quickly end by also pointing out at this time, Babasaheb was also in touch with C.H. Alexandrovich, who we discussed, I think, 2 weeks ago in the seminar, the founder of the so-called Madras School of International Law. And in fact, in 1954, Alexandrovich gets Ambedkar elected as a vice president of the World Committee on Comparative Law. So again, these are sort of, interesting nuggets in his interest in international law. Now, just to end, because I know I've gone on far too long, I think what is very interesting is if we had to take an appraisal of this long survey of his interest in international law, his multidisciplinary training in history, political science, economics, and anthropology enables him to seamlessly navigate between very diverse subjects. And although he does not study and practice international law, Babasaheb seems very much at ease at a subject that itself is changing radically over the course of his career, between the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations and the founding of the United Nations and beyond. And at the core of his interest, of course, is in trying to argue for greater minority and rights protections for Dalits, which arises out of his interest or his universalist understanding of minority rights. James Cabera has argued this very well, which distinguishes Ambedkar from many of his other contemporaries who believed such arrangements would infringe on national sovereignty, right? Very much a debate we still have today. Yet, puzzlingly, very few scholars have appraised Ambedkar's contributions to international law. In fact, it's particularly surprising that this neglect extends to this the so-called Twale scholarship. Professor Chimney is one of those who inspired this movement. It'd be good to get his reflections on this. I think Twale is now recognizing the impact of Ambedkar, but Twalers have largely remained silent about Ambedkar and his skillful marshalling of international law against Dalit discrimination. And part of the neglect among Twale, Twale is the third world approaches to international law, which sort of, is a critique of international law by, scholars who argue it's sort of too dominated by the West. And part of the neglect of Ambedkar by Twale might be methodological rather than intentional. Srinivas Pura has a very interesting article saying Twale might overlook Ambedkar because he did not necessarily share the anti-colonial theology of someone like Gandhi or Nehru, right? So it would be interesting, and I'd like to hear Professor Chimney. But I think that we can still debate this, and I just want to end, though, with one thing to come back to a full circle to where we began with James Shotwell, because 4 years after Ambedkar passed away, which is 1956, Shotwell publishes this book called Long Way to Freedom, where he discusses for the first time his former student's legacy. He does not reveal that the great untouchable leader, as he calls him, studied with him at Columbia. Perhaps he had not even remembered it. But it is very interesting that he notes, the teacher finally notes posthumously the students' contributions. because it was probably the teacher's influence that contributed in some sense to the students' sort of interest in the subject of international relations and his more cosmopolitan outlook, which I guess which I've suggested, it remains to be more meaningfully analyzed beyond the traditional confines of constitutional law and social justice, for which we know Babasaheb played a big role in. Thanks again. Sorry I took so long.
Thank you so much, Vikram, for that fantastic presentation, rich with information. May I please request Poco to take over?
Yeah. Thanks to Vikram Anna, Ajita Sharma ma'am, Prabhakar Singh sir, and other esteemed members for this wonderful opportunity. And also greetings to legal luminaries and young friends. I would offer short comments on this wonderful paper and talk, whatever you want to call it. I would just read it out because I'm a bit nervous. Babasaheb Ambedkar was easily the greatest intellectual icon modern India had ever witnessed. As you know, Upendra Bakshi charts that he was multifaceted and everybody would be knowing it. And he was an economist, lawyer, jurist, constitutional authority, journalist. And this year we are celebrating his 100 years of publication of his first journal, that is Mook Nayak, and pioneer of global human rights. Vikram Raghavan, with remarkable precision and scholarly pursuit, has illuminated Ambedkar's interventions in the arena of international law. He draws our attention to ideas of Ambedkar which haven't received wide attention in intellectual probing. I will just add my comments and appreciation here. Professor Shotwell makes repeated appearances in this paper. Political scientist Swil Kilnally calls him in his book Incarnations. Shotwell is an authority on labor and human rights. Ambedkar, to his credit, during his stay in Columbia University, as Vikram Anna told, has mastered, actually there is 30 subjects. If you take 30 credits enough, but Ambedkar took 60 credits. It is effectively charted in Columbia University's site. You can look at it. The subjects which he chose were economics, sociology. Economics was his prime subject, and he had chosen sociology, history, philosophy, and anthropology. He had engaged with scholars of his time and the scholars of erstwhile times, and so those ideas, he engaged with those ideas and took them forward. So it really enriched Indian socio-political life. And Vikram Raghavan traces the interesting connection between Ambedkar and Shotwell in furtherance of labor rights through ILO and UN, and Ambedkar's role as a member, as labor member. But I will just add two important points. Anurag Bhaskar sir is there. In his book, he's introduced this book, A Stake in the Nation. In that also he draws our attention, but I would just repeat it to an extent. One needs to look at Ambedkar's state and minorities. After this 1946 elections where his party didn't do well, he had actually drafted a draft constitution. And that constitution, it's called as state and minorities. It was in many ways an Ambedkarite constitution. As Professor Sukhdev Thorat calls, the constitutional socialism is the main theme, running theme of the state and minorities. According to Professor Neeraja Gopal Chayal, Ambedkar was the strongest articulator of social and economic rights in Constituent Assembly. Ambedkar's draft preamble in this work dreamt of United States of India. It is very interesting, even though he became a proponent of unitary state, like a kind of quasi-federal state with a unitary bias. Here he talks about a United States of India, which should strive to remove social, political, and economic inequality by providing better opportunities to submerged classes. And it is very interesting. Professor Neeraja Gopal Chayal argues that Ambedkar played a stellar role in the subcommittee on fundamental rights in Constituent Assembly, and they were, especially Ambedkar, was influenced a lot by Hirsch, Lauterpacht's, an international bill of the rights of man. The subcommittee on fundamental rights went on to prescribe that the union and state government should, within the limit of their economic capacity and development, provide for, not for DPSP, it is for fundamental rights, provide for fundamental rights to work, to education, and assistance in case of unemployment, sickness, and old age. In COVID times, we can grapple with these ideas. Also, influenced by Lauterpacht's bill, Ambedkar had put forth a proposal that we should provide just and humane conditions of work and maternity relief for workers. So basically, Ambedkar tries to extend the contours of socio-economic democracy within the constitutional framework. So in the end, you can see that he proposed fundamental right to work, education, and also assistance in case of unemployment and all. But Neeraja Gopal says it's very puzzling that Ambedkar accepted to move it to DPSP, Directive Principles of State Policy. But it is worth remembering the unfinished dream of Babasaheb and his influence from international treaties on rights of man. And now Vikram Raghavan Anna also draws our attention to Ambedkar's attempts in internationalizing Dalit cause through international organizations, League of Nations and United Nations. And it is interesting that Ambedkar also engaged with NGOs or non-government organizations like Pacific Relations Conference and International Conciliation Group. And the idea to take the Dalit issue to United Nations has started way back in 1942. Then only the idea to that United Nations should be started was propounded. And N. Shivaraj, the trusted lieutenant of Ambedkar, who hailed from my own Madras presidency and went on to lead the Republican Party of India after Babasaheb's death, actually states in All India Depressed Classes Conference that they should take their cause to Grand Tribunal of United Nations. It is very interesting. It is in 1942-43 times. And Kanshiram in his text Samcha Age lists 5 texts of Babasaheb as his favorite books. One is Mr. Gandhi and the Emancipation of Untouchables. It was the text that was read in Pacific Relations Conference held in Quebec, Canada, 1942. In this text, even though it is for Dalit cause, Ambedkar engages with various representations across the world. He talks about occupational and functional representations, the pros and cons of them. Then he takes further the minority rights. There is this beautiful article in Radical Ambedkar by Partha Chatterjee on theorizing Ambedkar's minority rights. Here, Ambedkar in this text, what he does is that he argues for protection of minority rights, not only based on their numbers, but based on the needs and importance. So basically, Babasaheb tries to expand the scope and idea of minority rights beyond the concepts of proportional representation. In this text, it is interesting that Babasaheb talks about global concerns of racism, imperialism, anti-Semitism, and he expresses his concern that these problems must be tackled so that a new and better world will emerge from the ashes of the terrible and devastating Second World War. I would like to quote a moving paragraph from this remarkable book. The world owes a duty to the untouchables, as it does to all suppressed people, to break their shackles. And further, Babasaheb adds that this work will serve as a notice to higher caste Hindus that they will have to answer for it before the bar of the world. As Professor Luis Cabra argues, Ambedkar has actually indicated a cosmopolitan legal framework where vulnerable minorities, it may be either Jews, it may be blacks, or let's say Afro-Americans, and Dalits, facing would be able to bring their charges to an impartial global level judge. This would represent a significant development of element globally in concrete institutions of global citizenship. Ambedkar expressed his solidarity with persecuted Jews, countries who had suffered due to communist excesses, and especially Afro-Americans. It is not that only Babasaheb was alone in his vision. Even though this paper focuses on Babasaheb and international law, it is important that this vision was shared by his comrades or the members of his movement. For example, there is this person called as Rajaram Bole. He was the candidate of Independent Labour Party in 1937. He won the elections. He went on to become a judge and in independent India, and he was member of this famous Mandal Commission. And he went to Britain in 1944. He wrote a tract there, which is titled "An Untouchable Speaks the Truth About India Today." It was published by a company called as Britain Publishing Company. In this, he tries to internationalize the Dalit cause. But he reminds the reader that in World War II, thousands of scheduled castes are fighting today for the cause of world freedom. He appeals to the freedom-loving nations and parties to undoubtedly support Dalit cause. And he, N. Shivaraj, and other esteemed members of this Dalit movement, which Ambedkar is leading, they were expressing concerns about Afro-Americans, persecuted Jews, and women across the world. And so basically, Ambedkar and his movement members were showing a deep sensitivity towards international issues and welfare of suppressed classes, cutting across class, gender, race, even nationality. As this paper, basically the paper just provided to me, and because short of time, Anna rushed it, but he spoke about minority rights and self-determination. And I would love to draw your attention to Ambedkar's talk as labor member in 1943. It's a very interesting talk. It is titled "Why Indian Labor is Determined to Win the War." He speaks about various issues with self-determination, and then he defines nationalism, and then he takes it to internationalism. It's very interesting. He says, the principle of self-determination expresses the desire of a people united by common ideals and common purposes to decide without external compulsion. Its political status, whether independence, interdependence, or union with other people of the world. This is called as nationalism. Now he goes into internationalism. He says, labor's creed is internationalism. Labor is interested in nationalism only because the wheels of democracy, such as representative parliaments, responsible executive, constitutional conventions, etc., work better in a community united by the national sentiments. Nationalism to labor is only a means to an end. It is not an end in itself to which labor can agree to sacrifice what is regards as the most essential principles of life. And he then says that nationalism has to repair, transform, and recreate the body politic. If nationalism stands in the way of rebuilding and reshaping of labor's life, then labor must deny nationalism. And basically he ends with like this: labor can't allow the living faith of the dead to become the dead faith of the living. I would repeat this: labor can't allow the living faith of the dead to become the dead faith of the living. Labor will not allow the ever-expanding spirit of man to be strangled by the hand of the past, which has no meaning for the present and no hope for the future. Nor will it allow it to be cramped in a narrow jacket of local particularism. Ambedkar basically what he does is that if you read this speech, you would understand he links and differentiates nationalism, internationalism, labor cause, and self-determination all in a single speech with unbelievable coherence and conviction. And basically, I would just make two quick points and finish it. Ambedkar, in his letter to Finance Minister of India in 1949, he has written about the question of whether India should join Commonwealth and constitutional challenges ahead to achieve the same. He makes a striking sentence in this letter. Is the choice of words and the way he articulates it is quite amazing. He says, Constitution of India will not permit us to have a closer link with the Commonwealth, but our needs will not permit us to have a looser link with the Commonwealth. And then what he does is that he lists what are the futures of being a dominion within British Empire, such as common loyalty, and the king appoints basically a governor general to rule that dominion. And he says there should be allegiance to the king. And then what he does is that Ambedkar consults Britain Nationality Act and Canadian Nationality Act. He also draws our attention to deals struck by D. Welleran, Irish leader of the British Empire. Ambedkar says instead of India trying to have an agreement with Britain as a component state, it should basically try to be an associate state like Ireland, so that in Commonwealth it can protect its rights, which were enshrined in its constitution, and also its economic freedom. And it's very interesting that Ambedkar doesn't stop short of this. He goes on to speak about Commonwealth, what are its problems. It says it doesn't have much discussion about foreign policy, and there is no mechanism to solve inter-dominion disputes of dominions or countries within Commonwealth. And Commonwealth membership doesn't result in citizenship. To an extent, maybe he anticipated European Union to an extent in some ways. And finally, I would conclude with this, that Babasaheb actually grappled with questions of international law, but interestingly, it was driven by values of equality, liberty, fraternity, and an international outlook, which cared for other persecuted citizens, suppressed classes, and also he stopped sort of taking Dalit issue to UN, but he complained in his 1951 resignation speech. He lamented the fact that the same old tyranny, same old oppression, same old discrimination still exists for scheduled caste. That is a point worth remembering. And Babasaheb was a pioneer in his times, and there are a lot of legal luminaries over there, and there is at least 17,000 pages of Babasaheb's collected works. And Vikram speech serves as a starting point. There is a lot more, and hope his esteemed members would take care. And thanks for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you so much for your discussion, Poco. Let's open it up for questions. If you have questions, please unmute yourself and you can straight away ask questions, or you can post it on the chat.
Before the questions begin, I would like to convey my appreciation actually in a few words. Thank you, Vikram, so much. Completely blown away. And I must admit that this has to be the most brilliant presentation in terms of content, canvas, scope that I've had the pleasure of attending in the last 10 years, and I mean no exaggeration. Equally excellent was Puko's wonderful, clear appreciation of what you just presented, as well as tying it to the works of Dr. Ambedkar that he's aware of. And I, as someone who has been trying to work in international in the last 10 years, 10, 11 years, this one presentation actually, makes me feel how and why we look at certain materials, and why in how certain materials are ignored, and how certain materials actually come into the ambit of our recognition, or and why certain scholars are left out. It could be for a number of reasons, and I'm not here to guess that. But all I'm saying is that this was such a brilliant presentation, and really opening our minds to the intellectual archives of Babasaheb Ambedkar, whose works, I think, as you pointed out very clearly, even TWIL has ignored. One would assume that something as radical and a movement as TWIL should have actually looked at him, but we have not looked at him. And again, we need to to sort of introspect on this point as well. So thank you very much, and let's open the floor for questions. Thank you.
I think while we are waiting for a question, I wanted to also join you, Prabhakar, in thanking Puko for his very, very insightful, concise, especially after my rambling talk. He nicely tied a bow on it in his usual precision. And I keep complaining that the Tamil benefit of his scholarship, because he writes in Tamil and he engages in Tamil. But the rest of India also needs to benefit from his erudition and learning. So I'm glad that he was able to join us today. And I think that it also is through him I realized how much there is to learn about not just Babasaheb, but the sort of overlooked aspects of international law in social justice, right? And I think that sometimes international lawyers tend to be highly doctrinaire, very black letter. And so in a way, this is a good reminder for us, to sort of situate our work in context, but also in the lives of people. I guess there's a question.
Thanks for the warm words, Anand, and for the opportunity also. I was a bit nervous, but I managed. I cruised through, I guess.
No, you present your presentation, as Vikram said, was very concise, and it's wonderful to sort of have this overview of his works. Thank you. So we have one question actually. Ajita, are we?
Yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So we have a question from Dr. Ashish Kumar, who's a faculty at University of Delhi. He says, Babasaheb has a clear, just so many messages. Babasaheb has a clear take that treaties, conventions can be broken under certain circumstances. How do you see this in view of his wider call for an international legal system?
Yeah, it's a. By the way, I think Dr. Gandhi has a question that follows. Also, he put his hand up. But no, thank you, Dr. Ashish Kumar. That's a good question. To be honest, I don't know. I think that I would struggle to articulate what would have been Babasaheb's wider vision on international law. It needs to be reconstructed, but also with care and meticulousness. My biggest worry is that we can oversimplify. Because it's a complex life, a sprawling life, with inevitable contradictions, not necessarily intellectual contradictions, but contradictions that will often are result of maneuvering difficult practical challenges. So this idea that he advocates that you can break a treaty is a skillful lawyer's argument he makes, right? In part because he is there not necessarily presenting his view, but defending the government, the British government's passage of a law, right? So he, in that sense, is an advocate. I think Rohit Day gives us a very good article about, which I think everyone should read, which was first presented at the same conference at which I sort of explored this work, on Ambedkar's life as a lawyer and the type of cases he took. And they are very diverse. You would not expect, it's not like he argued only social justice. He appeared for the Maharaja of Kapurthala, I think, or Darbhanga, I forget which one. He often took cases where were not necessarily ideologically aligned to his cause, right? So in a sense, I think that I approach this material with some let's say repetition, because I'm worried about making too many overgeneralizations, especially when we are dealing with a field which itself was very much developing. I think I'm just stunned by how much he engaged with a field which itself did not have, Prabhakar and Ajita can tell us, there were not that many Indians engaging with international law at this time, right? And certainly there were no leading scholars of international law. Those who thought of international law, again, Prabhakar's research tells us, were mostly in the context of princely states, and then this whole issue of the Commonwealth, which Foucault has explained to us, right? Those were the twin obsessions. I can't think of that many other Indians who were actually thinking of the League of Nations protections and looking at international law arbitration, certainly in the way that he did in his time. In fact, Alexandrovitz is brought to India in 1950 to really create the first school of international law, to train people to think in this manner. Professor Chimney had to leave, but it would have been good to get his reflections on this issue. But yeah, I think I need to think a little bit more about that, Dr. Ashish Kumar. Thank you again for your comment and the question. I think Professor Gandhi had a question. He had raised his hand.
Just to add to what Vikram has just said in response to the question asked by Dr. Ashish Kumar, again I'm hazarding a guess, and those of us who went to Columbia University should have known more about it, I think. And I hope those who went to Columbia University from our faculty should be here listening to this presentation. Now, at Columbia University, we had this great champion of this idea of breaking treaty. Wellington Koo from Taiwan was a student at Columbia University. He wrote his doctorate at Columbia University on treatment of aliens. I'm not saying that they must have conversed or something, but he was the greatest champion alive, particularly after the First World War, League of Nations, of the idea of rebus sic stantibus. That is the maxim of sort of breach of treaties under, or the right to break treaties when circumstances fundamentally change. That was the thesis that that Wellington Koo gave, and both Babasaheb Ambedkar and Wellington Koo happen to be Columbia graduates. I don't know if they met or there's some research to be done there, but that is, at least as international lawyer who knows nothing about the works of Ambedkar and international law, the only connection I see is that of Columbia University and Wellington Koo being the champion of this idea that he actually vociferously used at the Washington Conference in the 30s. So maybe, again, hazarding a guess, I don't have concrete evidence, but yeah, just that point. Anyways, go ahead. Thank you.
Maybe, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, Vikram, it is a wonderful piece of research, and I have, never unraveled history in terms of international law, because, we are all forensic lawyers, more looking into the principles, as now you know that you are the World Bank, and we will just, look like a checkerboard, that's all. We will just see the coins and where to just move on to get the desired end. That is what our thing is. But it is so wonderful because it reminded of the Babasaheb Ambedkar. He made all the avenues where he can bring out the discrimination. So I found in his whole life a kind of an activist with advocacy. So, the first point, you referred rightly that it was the League of Nations and then ILO, self-determination, arbitration, and the dropping of paramountcy, And all these things indicate a clear, a common thread running through that. That if you take it as a social justice as a means, and you want to, make use of this, when you get a social justice as an end, you have to make whichever means possible. That is what we try to do. I think, to my mind, it looks like that. Say, for example, the old book, I think definitely you would have read that. That is my feeling. The social justice and the law of nations was linked by Professor Wilfred Judge. And if you see that the year that he was very active and the publication of the year of that book, you can find that the social justice element was too much concentrated at the particular point of time where the League of Nations was established. And we know that, the poverty everywhere is a threat to prosperity anywhere. And that it starts with like, this is a league, In fact, you would have read all these things. The simple idea is that the activist in him, and he wants to find out what are all the methods and means by which I can bring this about, whether national means or international means. I think he acted and he was faithful to that. That is my assumption. Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Gandhi. As many of you know, Dr. Gandhi was the legal advisor to the Ministry of External Affairs and one of the top international lawyers of India. So I'm very honored that he joined us. I know Prabhakar and Ajita would also join me in saying that, and I appreciate your intervention. I guess I wanted, sorry, go ahead, Prabhakar.
Good to see him after almost 4 years. Thank you.
I also wanted to just thank you. I don't have anything to add to what you said because you have summed up in brilliantly in a minute what both Puko and I tried to convey. And now we have to only visit you in Vellore to the law school that you have started.
It is not Vellore. It is not Vellore. It is Chennai.
It is Chennai, but it's in the name of.
It is not in Chennai. It is not in Vellore. It is in Chennai.
Yes. I also see Sudarshan also has joined us, and so I'm grateful. One question that came up, I think, from Rohini, I'm just trying to find it, was this issue of if you could speak more about the interstices in colonies where one could see international law as an emancipatory tool while noting its colonial grounding. I'm not sure I know enough to answer this question, to be completely honest, Rohini, because I don't want to start off on an issue that, and I wonder whether Prabhakar and Ajita might have more insights on this topic. If I maybe understand the question, is, well, international law itself, again, the doctrine of self-determination itself is still sort of, there's a new thesis which I read the other day, which is a decline and fall, or the rise and fall of self-determination in international law. So I don't know, I wonder whether Prabhakar, you might have some reflections on that question, because it's a bit outside my professional as well as personal capacity to answer.
Same here, actually, Vikram. I really have not looked into that aspect. So actually, I'm.
Yeah, me neither.
Yeah, no, but Rohini, it's an important question, and the only reason I'm reluctant to answer is it's a very complicated subject, which, frankly, I mean, I know we all know the basics, but it's hard to provide a reasoned view on it, only because this is such a sprawling field too. In a way, international law has now become so specialized. I would not hazard a guess, but I also wanted to just, I think there was another question that just came in on something else.
Can I?
Sorry?
I am also interested to ask a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Vikram, for this very interesting lecture on international law. So I also study Ambedkar. I just submitted my PhD on Ambedkar. So I'm a student of political theory and political philosophy. So I had a sense when you were talking about international law. So during this was Rohit Vemula, after post Rohit Vemula movement. During that time, I had a realization, and I sense that the demand of, or the necessity of, the international law is really important. Why? Because when we read Indian Constitution, there is, it is said that it is India is a sovereign country. At the same time, India should not be ruled by the external forces. But I realize that, and I have no hesitation to say that this, the regime that we are going through, that how the rights and the liberty are being curtailed, it has been absent on the public life. So then I feel that the sense of the demand and the necessity of the international law and the international organization, particularly the organization who can actually take care of this law, rights, and the liberty of people. So in that case, actually, the idea of Dr. Ambedkar's international law actually makes sense to actually theorize. I am not an expert in law field, or I'm not a student of law, so but I am a student of political theory, so that I can think about this insecurity that actually now the Indian society and in is going through. So in that case, actually, the demand and the necessity of international law from an Ambedkar point of view actually makes sense to think about international body where you can have you can actually uh, mm, put forward your view, as Ambedkar was doing in having dialogue with Du Bois and trying to take this Dalit case into the UN body. So in that case, I think even today also, however we have constitution, however we have very vibrant democracy, but same time we also see the the absence of rights, also the curtail of liberty. So in that case, I think if you have any reflection or think about it, you can offer something. But thank you for this brilliant presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mahanand. I don't really have much to add to what you say, and I look forward to reading your PhD thesis. But I do think that some of the points you made are interesting ones, which I need to reflect on further. And we hope that your thesis will actually also help increase our understanding of Ambedkar, only because even today we don't have a proper biography in a comprehensive sense of the man. So I think the more work on it, the better. So thank you for your remarks. I also wanted to see, I think my friend Suchin has raised an interesting question, which is, was Ambedkar's view of international law also reflective of many Indian leading intellectuals of the time, such as Tagore, Nehru, and even Vivian Bose, who mentions in a judgment about the coming of a future government that kept a great faith in internationalism and viewed nationalism only as stepping stone to an almost utopian world union. To be honest, I don't know. I think that I was struck in reading the materials by how vigorously Babasaheb opposed Nehru's view on foreign policy. In fact, I think that the 1954 Rajya Sabha speech, but also the All India Scheduled Caste Federation's general election manifesto, is a striking critique of early Nehruvian foreign policy, right? But I don't know much about Nehru's own view on international law. I know there's an article on the subject, and I haven't read it yet, and how to juxtapose that with Babasaheb's view. I certainly think it would be, not. It would not be irresponsible to say that Babasaheb was more engaged than Nehru with international law arguments, only because I think his training was very different. Right, Nehru had not studied in the U.S. and even his life as a lawyer was not as extensive, certainly as Gandhi or even Ambedkar's lives. And also the rigor of international legal argument, I think, was not really marshaled as effectively as Ambedkar did, because Nehru relied on theory and history to make his claims. But again, this is a generalization. I don't have a comprehensive view to be able to offer a reflection on that thought. But it's an interesting one. I don't know. Maybe Puko can add something on this point Suchin and raised. Hello, is he there?
Yeah. Hello, Suchin Anna. I don't think it would be right, at least looking from the works of Ambedkar, to call him as one who aspired for an utopian world union. I would call him as more of an nationalist, not in the terms which we see now. He was more of a nationalist who was critical of the nation which was built upon inequality. And basically what he was trying to do is that he repeatedly tries to engage in India to have a conversation, which even Aishwari Kumar calls as radical attempt towards radical equality. Basically, he was trying to engage with various Congress leaders and other people on various questions. And when it doesn't seem to work, he in his interview to, I guess, Beverly Nicholas, he actually aspired for something called a separate settlements for Dalits. Basically, he thought that it is no more use in living with caste Hindus. He thought, let's get more land and move away from these people. And basically, he was grappling with this Dalit question. At the same time, he had imagined a world where cosmopolitanism can prevail, where we can engage with others, have some shared interest, at the same time protecting our own interest. So at least maybe Babasaheb went on to live for another 20 years. He could have evolved his views, but from the writings which is available to us, it won't be right to call him as an internationalist who aspired for a world union. Even in this 1954 speech, there is a scathing critique of communism. He calls it as a forest fire, and he says it consumes everything, and he sounds like more of a nationalist or who is interested in national interest of India. So, and even this Commonwealth stuff, if you look at it, he poses the question gauging with Indian interests. And so, but at the same time, he also said that as a nation, if you want to exist as a nation, he in one of his articles, he says that there is physical unity, where is social union. So he wanted that social union built upon equality, but that is not a global vision. Even it is one of the questions which Louis Scarborough says that he was saying that Dalits issue is much more, what you can say is that they were suppressed more than blacks. So it is very interesting to see in that way. He was more of a leader who is worried about his people's cause, then others issues came next to him. Yeah.
I think there's one more question from Nihal. Also, I think Foucault's answer may have covered it, but maybe you can reflect on that, because I don't know. I think, and I don't know if you want to close after that, Prabhakar, because we have come to the. I don't want to overstay over, but I think Foucault's reflection on this now makes me think that maybe he should be answering this question, because he's actually engaged with Ambedkar much more deeply than I have, and so I'm very grateful he could join us. Do you have any reflection on that point that Nihal has raised?
I'm just reading it, Anna. Just a minute. Yeah.
Because I think in terms of within international law, the communications between Ambedkar and other post-colonial theorists, I don't know. I don't know if he was communicating with that many other post-colonial theorists who also engage in international law. Even the Du Bois correspondence, I don't think that it will be interesting to see how much the NAACP itself was using international law at that time. I think Professor Nico Slate's article, what's it called, Shared Cosmopolitanism, explores that theme, but I don't know enough on it to be able to provide a informed answer. But do you have any view on that question?
Basically, I also didn't come across him engaging with post-colonial theorists and leaders, but he was engaging with I won't call them as post-colonial leaders like Jan Smuts and Winston Churchill. And I think Jesus Chires as an interesting article, because he thought after this Labour government doesn't seem to be favorable with him, Ambedkar basically communicated with Winston Churchill, and interestingly, Winston Churchill kept on raising untouchable issue in Britain Parliament repeatedly after that. And even Jan Smuts, he had tried to, after India tried to reprimand South Africa in UN, he engaged with Jan Smuts also. Basically, what Babasaheb was trying to ensure that they get equal status, because he was worried how much the state which is going to forthcome would look like. But maybe you have to check further. Post-colonial leaders and theorists, but it's very interesting that I don't know which author, but that author says Du Bois didn't exercise so much of sensitivity towards caste question, but Ambedkar exercised so much of sensitivity and understanding of race question. He had read various scholars, I think Apatekar, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing him right, many other scholars who were authorities on race during Du Bois' time, and he was reading them. And there is this one important piece, I think it is Untouchables and Slaves. He compares slavery across Greece, Roman, Jews, and even he goes on to compare them with Afro-Americans, and it comes to India. And he read a lot of people, but we have to dig further to check whether And it is one article says that he engaged even with that I don't get his name suddenly, a Nobel Prize winning thinker, and he's an Englishman, Bertrand Russell. And Scott Stroud says that they never met, even though they were engaged and he was interested in his work. Bertrand Russell, he never met him. It's an interesting piece. It's like a thriller novel. You should read it. And he says that he went through a lot of diary entries, and it's a very interesting piece. And he says that they never met, but Babasaheb engaged with his works. So we have to dig further, and sometimes you have to check their correspondences and see, because Babasaheb didn't have that mechanism and money to properly curate and compile everything. And a lot of his papers have been lost because of the struggles between his heirs. So that's one point too, that we lost a lot of things.
Thank you. So with that last intervention, we've come to an end to a wonderful session. I thank you, Vikram and Puko, for giving us your valuable time and agreeing to deliver a talk. Thank you, everyone, for patiently listening to us and engaging. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
you, Ajita. Thanks, Prabhakar. Thank you, Puko.
This wonderful presentation also ends our series for this fall 2020 that we had organized on the history of international law. It has been truly a great learning experience for us as organizers, and we are just we are very, very honored that you contributed not just in your talk but in other talks with inputs and what to do and what issues to raise. So thank you again, and hope to connect with you again on this or other platform.